Welcome everyone to our Global Sixties Colloquium tonight. Last time we were talking about Pakistan, and today we're going to talk about Bangladesh in the Global Sixties, and we're very, very happy to have our distinguished colleague here, Subho Basu, who is an Associate Professor of History and Classical Studies at McGill University in Canada. Professor Basu received his PhD from the University of Cambridge, and his research and teaching interests are South Asian history, history of Bangladesh and Pakistan, subaltern and decolonial studies, international development studies, and democracy and society in India. He's the author of two books, Does Class Matter? Colonial Capital and Workers' Resistance in Bengal from 1890 to 1937, published by Oxford University Press in 2004 as part of the South Asia series sponsored by SOAS, the University of London. And most recently, his Intimation of Revolution, Global Sixties and the Making of Bangladesh, published by Cambridge University just last year. So hot off the press, and we're very eager to hear more about that. In addition, he's also co-authored two books, one entitled Paradise Lost, State Failure in Nepal with Ali Riaz, published in 2007 with Lexington Books, and Rethinking Indian Political Institutions with Crispin Bates, published in 2005 by Anthem Press. Tonight, Professor Basu is going to talk about that recent book, The Global Sixties and the Making of Bangladesh. We're very, very happy to have him here with us. So please give a warm welcome to Professor Basu. And Professor Basu, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Klimke. Well, I actually read, when I started doing research on Global Sixties, I actually read Professor Klimke's book on the United States and Germany and the connections, transnational connections in terms of Global Sixties. So Global Sixties is an interesting concept that encompasses various types of social movements, political developments, and cultural connectivities, etc. And at the same time, it is, to a certain extent, a kind of subject area that includes everything, but almost is too diffused. Yet the image of 60s as a transformative radical era has proved to be enduring. As Thor Forland points out, it is only the 60s among all other decades of the 20th century that has a journal devoted to its events. And this journal, in its aims and scope, boldly announces, as Forland asserts, that it is the only academic peer-reviewed journal to focus solely on this transformative decade of history. The key term here is the word transformative. The era has become associated with revolutionary and radical confrontations between the forces of establishment, the global insurgencies, and experiments with alternative living in the advanced capitalist world. Throughout the world, successive generations of politicians and social activists have waged cultural wars, defending or attacking the radical meanings of the 60s as well as their historical legacy. The decade began with the polarizing but hugely successful national liberation struggle in the Caribbean in Cuba. The Cuban Revolution of 1959 appears to announce the beginning of an era that would be volatile and unpredictable, for it did not follow any predetermined master narratives of revolutionary transformation. Intellectually, the Global Sixties began with the writings of Frantz Fanon, Che Guevara's Foucault theory, and Regis Debre's Revolution in the Revolution, alongside Mao Zedong's On Practice and Contradiction. And obviously, there was also Mao's little red notebook, a red book, has become very popular in Global Sixties. These texts became central to the art of making revolution and were even read in disparate locations such as Palestine, Algeria, France, Congo, and East Pakistan. Even Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialist perspective of Marxism and Louis Althusser's ruminations on the development of Marxist thought became critical sources for the debates that raged in the dingy and overcrowded Madhu's canteen in Dhaka University. The decade was marked by Cultural Revolution in China, Tet Offensive in Vietnam, a seemingly revolutionary coup, and a reactionary counter-coup in Indonesia, culminating in genocidal events, student-led revolutionary activities in Pakistan, the victory of the United Front in West Bengal, in India, combined with the rise of Naxalite movements, followed by the conclusion of the Algerian War. Furthermore, the beginnings of the Palestinian national liberation struggle, the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia, the student uprising in France, Mexico, the United States, and West Germany, the civil rights movements in the United States, and of course, the global peace movement, the anti-nuclear weapons campaigns, and the rise of the New Left transformed the 60s into a decade of hope, protest, and rebellion. It was also an era when the new aesthetics emerging in literature, theater, film, and musicals began to create spaces to forge a counter-hegemonic cultural domain among the youth throughout the world. Many among the youth, through such counter-hegemonic cultural discourse, raised questions about modes of governance and the existing ways of doing politics. Since the end of that decade, global approaches to the 60s and considerations of the global 68 have become a critical point of intervention in the social sciences. The epistemology of the global 60s starts with Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It is now widely accepted that a global analysis of the 60s is untenable without an extended conversation with historical conditions of the Third World. Frederick Jameson, a literary scholar, rightly locates the beginning of what will be called the 60s in the Third World. So I start this, my own engagement with global 60s from the perspective of global South. My work examines a rather understudied revolution that began in the predominantly agrarian society of Lower Gangetic Delta of East Pakistan. It seeks to provide a radical reading of the 60s in East Pakistan and further aims to situate it as an integral component of global 60s. The story of the global 60s starts with the intellectual flirtations of Bengali student activists with the contemporaneous revolutionary texts. In East Pakistan, which is today Bangladesh, in 1968-69, among the socialist-leaning but purely Bengali nationalist nuclear circle established by Sirajul Alam Khan and Qazi Arif Ahmed, the text of Che Guevara, Regis Debre, Voguen Giap, and Mao were prescribed as essential readings. For these nationalist student revolutionaries, there was much romance to be found in the idea of a Bengali nation state heralding in an exploitation-free society. As Jameson maintains, the supposedly unplussed collectives, such as students, played as much of a role in the making of East Pakistani global 60s as in other locations. Yet Jameson's oft-quoted observation that Marxist theory entered a crisis in the global 60s because active political categories no longer seem to be those of social class is a generalization based upon a particular reading of specific events which took place in Paris and other Western locations. In fact, throughout the history of East Pakistan, labor unrest had defined the political contour of democratic movements. Unfortunately, much of the historical literature on this subject in Bengali also views this working class unrest as a prefiguration of a nationalist awakening and thus confines them to the role of a mere appendage to the nationalist movement. However, in East Pakistan, the working class has rejected such a subsumption into a purely nationalist constitutional autonomy project. In fact, now a scholar, Adijul Islam Russell, is working on the on the working class movement in East Pakistan in 1960s. In fact, working class movements played a critical role. Working class played a critical role as a collective entity in the 1969 mass insurrection, which transformed the general movement in East Pakistan into a potent and threatening event against the ruling military junta. Alongside workers, the peasants were also mobilized along class lines based upon the emerging contradictions within the polity and economy between the rich peasants and the middle peasants. Many among these rich peasants were also constitutionally selected to be power brokers by the military-bureaucratic elites and termed basic democrats. These basic democrats had gained access to developmental funds, while other segments of the surplus farmers, namely middle peasants, did not have access to them. Though admittedly, the category of middle peasants is tenuous in East Pakistani context, Eric Wolf was not far off when he argued that the middle peasants constitute the pivotal groups in peasant rebellions of Mexico, Russia, China, Vietnam, Cuba, and Algeria. According to Wolf, poor peasants and landless laborers, depending on landlords for their livelihood, have very little tactical power within court and no independent resources to launch and sustain a rebellion. These middle peasants alone had the necessary minimal tactical freedom to challenge the established order. It was their children in East Pakistan who moved into schools, colleges, and universities and participated in the radical movements. Thus, class remained critical to political rebellion in the 60s in East Pakistan. Yet it would be obviously simplistic to assume that these antagonistic class contradictions automatically led to a revolution. Hannah Arendt's observation that the revolutionists watched the disintegration of society and took initiative once the revolution had broken out is possibly true in the context of East Pakistan of the 60s. Moving a step further, De Nardo, another scholar of revolution, has rightly argued that it was the strategists who had conceptualized the path of revolution, particularly in the case of China and Vietnam. In Pakistan, too, a Jacobin-minded pro-Chinese radical Muslim theologian, Maulana Bhashani, played a critical role in the mobilization of the 60s. He used red flags and red hats as symbols of peasant organization. Thus, the very symbol around which peasants gathered and organized themselves were associated with the communist movement. Class politics, even if the language was crafted by the radicals, remained inscribed on the 60s in East Pakistan. Revolutionists like Bhashani, despite their own inchoate ideological formulations of Islamic socialism, remained committed towards a radical redistributive agenda. There is a need to say a few words about Bhashani here. Maulana Abdul Hamid Khan Bhashani was born in a very poor peasant family, and then he trained himself as a theologian in India's famous Islamic theological school, Deoband, but he, in the process of the peasant mobilization against landlordism, became impressed with the Chinese agrarian communism. And as a consequence, Maulana Bhashani combined Islam with agrarian communism of China. And this was probably an attempt to create a kind of liberation theology of Islam in East Pakistan. The term long 60s is conceptualized by Arthur Marwick in the context of what he calls a cultural revolution in Germany, Italy, and France, as well as in the United Kingdom and the United States. The significance of this term lies in the acknowledgement that 60s cannot be studied as that time which passed between a pair of historical bookends, that is 1960 and 69. Rather, it must be studied in terms of shared objectivity of a particular historical moment that stretched beyond but incorporated events in that decade. The long 60s in East Pakistan began in 1954 with an election that took place in the context of a spasmodic and rickety constitutional process. It was this constitutional process that led to the gaining of a modicum of political powers by the politicians of the Awami League, a Bengali nationalist organization. This brief flirtation with power within court in the Pakistani state led to a split in this pivotal local autonomist organization over questions of Cold War alignment. For a brief period, when Awami League Supremo Hussain Shahid Surawardi was the prime minister, Pakistan joined the US-backed military blocs of the Baghdad Pact and the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. The decision to join such military pacts was guided by the security concerns of the emergent military-bureaucratic ruling class in Pakistan, but the League's active support of such a decision led to internal schism. Radicals, which included both communist and non-communist socialists such as Bhashani, questioned the necessity of political alignment that violated the basic principles of non-aligned movement. More importantly, these radicals felt that when political actors and emerging national liberation struggles in the Middle East and elsewhere in the Muslim world opposed such military blocs, it was imperative that Pakistan should stay away from such formations. Ultimately, these radicals formed a rival political organization, namely National Awami Party, based upon a program of opposition to imperial alignment. The close connections between the Cold War and military political alignments and the rise of a pro-Western, supposedly modernizing military junta in Pakistan defined a critical parameter of politics of the long 60s. This parameter was the general tendency to question the cultural politics of national integration as championed by military bureaucratic regimes. It was also a period marked by growing peasant protests, labor and student militancy in Pakistan. All these movements coalesced around an opposition to the capitalist modernization process, which had increased inequity along class, regional, and ethnic lines. These protests were also matched by a deeper social transformation marked by ethnic cleansing, capital flight from the eastern province, the changing dynamics of class formation, the immiseration of the peasantry, and the narrowing down of democratic possibilities of accommodation. In the 60s, the coup by pro-Western military dictator Ayub Khan gave birth to Praetorian capitalism, whereby a garrison state steadily pursued a policy of foreign aid-driven modernization. Military as an institution secured a pivotal role in the economic process and gave birth to an economy based upon both social inequality and regional inequality. Functional inequality as a necessary condition for economic growth was the new mantra of the regime. Politically, the military secured the loyalty of bureaucracy as a junior partner in the ruling coalition. Furthermore, through basically democracy, military strongman Ayub Khan built up a social coalition of incipient and dependent monopoly of industrial houses, and bribed rich peasants by providing them some control over developmental funds through a constitutional facade of basic democracy. Yet such social coalition did not include the vociferous middle classes, urban working classes, and rural subsistence peasantry. More importantly, the suspension of democracy created a phenomenon of minoritization of the majority, namely the Bengali-speaking population of East Pakistan. The people of East Pakistan could not translate their numerical majority into a parliamentary coalition, and their representation in the ruling military bureaucratic coalition remained minuscule. They did not have representation among the monopoly industrial houses as well. This then created a situation of internal colonization. In their readiness to escape from a Calcutta-centric internal colonization, Bengali Muslims found themselves in a situation of another colonization, where the new colonial rulers acted as a distant sovereign, even replicating certain British colonial stereotypes about Bengalis. As the global 50s and 60s witnessed the rise of Western-sponsored dictators in Asia, from Syngman Rhee in Korea to Suharto in Indonesia, there took place also wider resistance, culminating in 1968-69 throughout the world, known as the High 60s. In Pakistan, too, over the course of these years, there arose a period of high 60s. In 1968-69, marked by students, workers, and peasants openly revolting against the military-bureaucratic power edifice. Throughout the global South and in the Muslim world, the global 60s had its repercussions. So when did this period of revolutionary experimentation, cultural interrogations of the status quo, and a politics of hope, which were never left unmatched by their dialectical antipodes, fratricidal violence, coups, and military dictatorships, and Cold War violence, came to an end? By 1970, the idea of Bangladesh as a land of Bengalis had become more popular than the earlier nationalist notion of Pakistan as a homeland of Muslims. On 26 March 1971, the military crackdown on the radical nationalist movement snowballed into a genocide of East Pakistanis, who are now identified mostly as Bengalis. The guerrilla war of 1971, conducted amid the tensions of the Cold War with, and in some cases without, Indian assistance, culminated in the liberation of Bangladesh. I conclude that the beginning of the armed struggle, national liberation struggle in 1971, perceiving it as an end of an era. So I do not go into 1971, which I regard as a local version of a global Cold War. Yet, as Bernardine Dohrn, in a review of a book in the 60s in the United States, argued that 60s began in 1954, and the real news is that they are not over yet. Now, the adumbration of student revolution and the subsequent national liberation struggle in East Pakistan in relation to global 60s requires a conceptual reordering of the story of the so-called Bengali nationalism. The global frame of reference necessitates a new conceptual approach towards understanding local transformation within a transnational framework, one that is informed by the cross currents of multiple geopolitical, ideological, economic, and cultural questions. These questions indicate the concurrence of a similar set of actions across diverse geographical locations. For South Asians, the use of the term global 60s involve an attempt at the thematic exposition of local anti-colonial and wider imperial struggles. Various protest movements made attempts to mobilize class-based social configuration in the Cold War context. But the geopolitics of bipolar power configuration constricted as it constructed boundaries and determined the conclusions of these attempts. Despite radical left movements such as the East Pakistani National Army Party's efforts over the 50s to transcend the matrices of the Cold War, it was clear by 1971 that the resolution of the within democratic question would be unable to escape the whirlwind of geopolitical realities swirling around it. Gary J. Bass's The Blood Telegram and Sinath Raghavan's 1971, A Global History of the Creation of Bangladesh, aptly highlight the impact of Cold War alignments in the making of Bangladesh. Yet both these books, and in particularly Raghavan's, despite their strengths, delegitimize and ignore the critical role played by East Pakistani actors in their own liberation against the backdrop of multifarious concerns of different powers to Indian policy in the Cold War era. In recent years, new historical research on the making of Bangladesh and even Pakistan focuses primarily on 1971 as a landmark. In a thoughtful and engaging essay, Faisal Devji has called the emergence of Bangladesh as an end of post-colonial state. He points out that the emergence of Bangladesh gives birth to the depoliticized language of humanitarianism. And he puts the example of Kosovo and Bosnia and the question of humanitarian language and international intervention that it involves. He further argues, this is not to say, of course, that Bangladesh possesses no political language or imagination, only that the circumstances of its foundings have resulted in the emergence of a significant and anti-political narrative here, there. This is only exacerbated by the ambiguity, if not absence, of any national narratives about Bengali Muslims struggling for freedom before 1971 and the problem posed by their participation in the movement for Pakistan before 1947. Yet in many ways, this conclusion erases the complex story of internal colonization, an idea of nationalitarian political language that informs the long transition of collective political modernity, collective political identity of Bengali Muslims in East Pakistan. Anwar Abdel Malik outlines in his concept of nationalitarian, the nationalitarian phenomena is one in which the struggle against the imperialist powers of occupation has as its object, beyond the clearing of the national territory, the independence and sovereignty of the national state, uprooting in depth the positions of the ex-colonial power, the reconquest of power of decision in all domains of national life, the prelude to that reconquest of identity, which is at the heart of its resistance, undertaken on the basis of fundamental national demands and ceaselessly contested by every means available on every level, and notably on the internal level. Unpacking this concept, Neil Lazarus quotes from Fanon, who has emphatically asserted that it is the national liberation which leads the nation to play its parts on the stage of history. It is at the heart of national consciousness that international consciousness lives and grows. The very cultural imagining that led towards the formation of East Pakistan indicates the complex political imagining of freedom from both formal colonialism and internal colonization in 1947 and international consciousness. While formal colonialism had a negotiated end in South Asia, internal colonization did not end. Nilesh Bose has captured the cultural dynamics of the story of the formation of Bengali Muslim cultural identity in late colonial era. Indeed, the imagining of East Bengal as a Muslim land with its own cultural autonomy and political economic vitality was dashed to ground through another set of internal colonization involving political, identitarian, and economic modes of management in Pakistan. To revisit Devji in his important work on the Muslim Zion, he also misses the idea of sense of belonging of Bengali Muslims to their land and environment that informed their Pakistani nationalism in the 40s. He sweeps this under the carpet because he views Pakistani nationalism from the perspective of M.A. Jinnah and the Muslim League's All India Executive Committee. In 1947, at the very moment of birth of Pakistan, Muslim League leaders in Bengal, Surawardi and Abul Hasim, also floated a proposal of United Bengal. Indeed, in 1971 was a culminating point of a political journey that started long back. Though in no way such journey was unilinear and unidirectional. It assumed a complex form with various twists and turns. Obviously, no birth of a nation is a process strewn. Obviously, no birth of a nation is a process strewn with certitude. Pioneering Marxist historian Badruddin Omar has provided a story of the making of Bangladesh, and subaltern historian Ahmed Kamal has engaged with the period of the 50s, highlighting subaltern anger in East Bengal with insensitive bureaucratic state. Umar's masterly account of the language movement in East Bengal in Bengali provides an analysis of the events in East Pakistan between 1947 and 1952. Furthermore, Tariq Ali has provided an enriching chronicle of the student uprising of 1968-69. He also mentions the local and global context of the perennial crisis of the legitimacy of Pakistani state and political and economic reasons for the same. Nurul Kabir, a well-known Bangladeshi journalist, has written a monograph on the 60s uprising in Bangladesh. Though their treatment is episodic, these texts help us to understand the underlying political events and implicit as imagination of student action and workers' action in such movements. Three Bangladeshi scholars, Lenin Azad, Morshed Sofiul Hassan, and Shekhar Datta, have produced nuanced and complex accounts of events in the global 60s, explaining the role of political economy in such crisis. In addition, Hassan has analyzed the intellectual origins of various ideas that informed the process of the making of Bangladesh. As these accounts were in Bengali, they are not readily available to international readers. Given the politics of language in global academia, unless translated, these accounts would remain unknown in the international scholarly circle. Thus, the understanding of a crucial aspect of global 60s and South Asian history of nation formation in the post-colonial era would remain rather skewed, whereby Bengali Muslims would remain in exile to their own history, political imagination, and cultural predilections. More importantly, ideological contestations over the implications of the global 60s would remain unknown. Indeed, a critical characteristic of the global 60s is the complexities of ideological struggle within the left, which took place under the shadow of another Cold War, namely the Sino-Soviet rivalry. The critical impact of the Chinese Revolution on ideological debate within the left remains an studied subject. Although China's foreign policy reach was limited, its critique of Soviet positions had far-reaching effects. Beginning in the late 50s, numerous activists, politicians, and intellectuals traveled to China from East Pakistan. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was one of them. He has recalled his visit to China in elaborate detail in his unpublished autobiography and a travelogue. Bhashani, the Maulana Hamid Khan Bhashani, met directly with Zhou Enlai and deeply impressed by China's agrarian revolution. Indeed, in the 50s, the NAP, of which Communist Party of Bangladesh was a principal clandestine constituent, emerged as a major alternative to the Awami League, the pivotal advocate for East Pakistan's regional autonomy. However, the NAP lost its efficacy to some degree when the party split in 1967. The seemingly pro-Chinese Bhashani wing of the NAP played a critical role in organizing peasant protests during the 1969 struggle. But the division within the left among the pro-Soviet and pro-Chinese wings, and later the further fragmentation of the pro-Chinese left into several rival political formations, such as the Communist Party of East Pakistan, Marxist-Leninists, and the Communist Party of East Bengal, Marxist-Leninists, profoundly influenced the outcome of the global 60s in East Pakistan. The internal schisms within the left, and particularly pro-Chinese left's growing distance from the nationalist upsurge, created a power political vacuum within the protest movement. Meanwhile, the pro-Soviet Communist Party became closely aligned with the regional autonomy movement, but the party had no decisive influence due to its relatively smaller membership, and instead acted as a battered remnant of the earlier robust but clandestine communist network. Due to the internal paralysis of the left, Awami League could establish a hegemonic position within the pro-democracy movement. The revolution of 1969 opened up an opportunity to further radicalize the political agenda of Bengali nationalism. However, the left's confusion arising from their conflicting interpretations of the implications of Chinese geostrategic maneuverings in South Asia rendered them ineffective during the liberation struggle. In post-liberation Bangladesh, Cuba's own contribution to the ideological critique of Soviet Marxism was similarly profound. Many nationalist-minded Bengalis were inspired by Cuba's autonomous brand of Marxism, though they never followed its direct dictum or had links with the Cuban Communist Party. These independent Marxists established a National Socialist Party that sought to develop an independent stance on Bangladeshi politics based on Marxist interpretations, as well as opposition to what they called the Indo-Soviet axis of aggression. Thus, in turn, the fierce competition for ideological hegemony among the Soviet Union, China, and Cuba contributed to, in myriad ways, the fragmentation of the left. This, in turn, profoundly impacted the course of events in East Pakistan and Bangladesh. In doing so, the pro-Chinese communists posed a direct challenge to the more established Soviet-aligned center-left coalition of the Awami League, the Communist Party of Bangladesh, and pro-Soviet NAP. Armed confrontations in the post-liberation Bangladesh clearly had a deep historical resonance with similar splits happening elsewhere in the world. A second crucial theme, crucial in the Pakistani context, is that of internal colonization and the idea of, within quote, national liberations. These are the elements that lend such radical power to Sheikh Mujib and made Bengali nationalism new post-colonial force. Bengali nationalism has also sought to explore how other third world intellectual, political, and cultural currents shape the sentiments, strategies, and tactics of building post-colonial cultural identities. Broadly, this meant that the empowerment of the third world itself served as a driving force towards realization of Bengali political aspirations. For the left, the pursuit of national liberation required rupturing the compact of US foreign policy and the Pakistani military junta and their political economic policies, which I call Praetorian capitalism. The left also made the stranglehold of military-sponsored financial oligarchs over Pakistan's national resources a point of contestation. Consequently, the rhetoric of national liberation in East Pakistan, in its more radical forms, envisioned the absolute recuperation of national resources, the elimination of oligarchic control over national resources, complete sovereignty in international relations, particularly in relation to Pakistan and India, and the forging of a national consciousness. Like all nationalisms, the latter had a xenophobic impulse. This was articulated through a thinly disguised hatred towards Urdu-speaking minority in East Pakistan. Thus, a few within the national liberation struggle aimed at the purging not only of the bourgeois desires, but also putative non-national ones. The result was a complicated but untimely, ultimately unsuccessful process of repression of signs of cultural hybridity by Bengali nationalism. Nationalism thus acted as Damocles' sword on Bangladeshi society. Now, I would not go into details of the Bangladeshi politics later on. I would say that because of the confrontations between the center-left and the radical left, military stepped in and initiated a similar kind of military dictatorship like that of Ayub Khan's regime, a modernizing pro-Western and a regime with a kind of Muslim nationalism that came to power in Bangladesh between 1975 and 1989. In other words, what I am trying to point out in my research, that global 60s profoundly influenced politics in Bangladesh in three ways. The first was the student and workers actually read and studied the text associated with global 60s and discussed it among them and tried to formulate a revolutionary strategy. These texts were also discussed in the workers, study classes being held in the radical pockets in Dhaka industrial belt, in the industrial belt of Dhaka. And the second thing is this, which also had a profound influence of the global 60s on Bangladesh, and outcome of the student and workers movements and national liberation struggle was the Cold War between Soviet Union and China and the problematic relationship between Soviet Union, China, and Cuba. And this, to a certain extent, paralyzed the left and enabled the Bengali nationalists to become the central focus of the national liberation struggle. And third important aspect of it is obviously, which I did not discuss in it, but I can discuss it in the question answer session, is the imagination of global 60s articulated through poetry, through novels, through cinemas, in Bengali language in the East Pakistan. Now, I would end my talk. I particularly thank the organizers for inviting me, and Professor Martin Klimke and also Nisa Zakaria for their for their interest in my talk. And I would request that I would now conclude my observations on global 60s in Bangladesh.
Thank you so much, Professor Basu, for this wonderfully rich, comprehensive, almost tour de force, through the Bangladeshi and Bengali global 60s. I don't know where to start. There's so many questions. I want to encourage the audience, as always, to submit their questions, through the Q&A form, or just, signal to me, so that they can, give you the word and the voice, to also ask a question in person, whatever is most easy for you. It's so interesting because you started out, at some point saying at the beginning of your talk that the global 60s is almost a little too diffuse as a concept, for us to handle. But then you presented, obviously, I think, a very convincing, way of handling that very concept, in the case at hand. So I was just wondering, maybe we kick it off there. What is your thought process, on that global 60s as a concept? What are the tensions that you see? What are the shortcomings? What are the dangers and risks that you associate, with using that particular label? Because I think all of us have been grappling, with this methodological concept for a while. And I, for myself, have come to terms with it because I can see that it enables these kinds of conversations that we're just having. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the first thing is, actually you just gave an answer, is to the question that you have posed, is the transnational connections. Global 60s is a moment of the forging of transnational connections, and and translating revolutionary thoughts and protest against established orders in different contexts differently, but there were definite elements of threats. For example, in 1959, Bengali students produced a magazine edition on Africa, and focusing on Patrice Lumumba in Congo, and they drew a kind of lesson from the Congo's experience of transition. And there were poet Asad Chaudhry. There was a poem poet Asad Chaudhry actually conceptualized in that poem Africa as the rising continent in the global 60s. And obviously there is an element of tricontinental solidarity in those writings. So in other words, and there also exists, the painter Zainal Abidin drew sketches of Palestinian refugee camps, and that became a source of political inspiration in global 60s. There is also a kind of engagement with the students' movement in Paris, with the students' movement, anti-Vietnam War movement throughout the world. And these had an impact on global 60s in Bangladesh. So conceptually speaking, obviously there exists some kind of difference between the European and American experience of global 60s. It's the kind of generational revolt that is there, and the kind of countercultural quest. In the developing countries, or whatever the term we use, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, it took a much more a kind of movement towards deepening democratic process, but more than that, a kind of national liberation struggle and anti-imperial struggle. And in the Germany, for example, and in the US, there is also from the peace movement that emerged, for example, feminist movement, etc., and women's movement, that was not so prominent in many of these sites, particularly not in East Pakistan, etc. So it's a diffused concept, but still there is a transnational connection, still there is a, and the transnational connections could be realized into three kind of axes, I think. The first is the anti-imperialism, and second is the peace movement, and the anti-imperialism and the national liberation struggle. Second is the peace movement, and third is Cold War, not only between the US and Soviet Union, but between Soviet Union and China and Cuba acting as an independent player. So
No, go ahead.
yeah, these are the three axes that I find that played a critical role in reimagining the political, in reimagining the politics, culture, etc., in global 60s.
No, thank you. And I found your point that you made it very persuasive, that there is an understudying of the Soviet rivalry and its impact, on the left in the global 60s. When we look at that, I thought that is definitely, I feel, something that warrants greater attention.
Yeah.
Now, I wanted to ask you, I think one of the things that you mentioned also, I thought was a very good point. You quoted Bernardine Dohrn saying that the 60s began in 64 and are not over yet. And I think in many ways, what you have outlined is obviously, the afterlife, of the 60s as they're with us. Now, my question would be, in today's political discourse, how big of a role, do the global 60s play in your perception in Bangladesh?
Well, it plays a critical role in shaping the national identity in Bangladesh. Now, there is almost a one-party rule in Bangladesh. The very party that actually led the global 60s now monopolized political power and to a certain extent manipulated the electoral system. And so there is a kind of, resurgence of 60s is required to, to create a more democratic society in Bangladesh. That's one thing. The other thing is this, that there is a cultural, there is a cultural conflict going on that in Bangladesh, and that is what is more important to the people, the Bengali identity or the Bangladeshi identity, a national identity that highlights more the Muslim component in the making of Bangladesh. So these are the two most important factors that is playing a critical role. And then there is the kind of idea that, the ruling party always talks about reviving the spirit of the national liberation struggle in 1971. So all these factors, still inform and influence politics in Bangladesh. There is also the, the right of the workers is also the forefront. Now, Bangladesh had a very large number of women workers, garment industry, etc. And and they were to a great extent their living condition is precarious. So there is a new labor movement emerging that encompasses both women's rights and workers' rights and etc. And this is a continuation of global 60s.
Thank you. No, I think that's very interesting. No, I keep going, unless I'm being interrupted from the audience. So one of the things that I found interesting that you mentioned that you want to, if we have more time, talk a little bit more about the imagination, that was set free in this particular case with regard to poetry, novels, when dealing with the global 60s and its local manifestation. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, well, there was at the time of independence in Bangladesh, particularly in writing poetry, there was an overwhelming emphasis on the Muslim nationalism. But as as 1950s went on, we find there is a much greater emphasis was laid upon the struggle of, women, particularly individual women who were rendered helpless because they were widows and they came from the poorer segments of the society. Their struggle for land, access to surplus, access to livelihood, etc. And this was reflected in a very famous book, a novel called Surjodi Khalbari by Abu Ishaq. There were different kind of understandings of the Bengali identity based on their peasant roots and their struggle against internal colonization. And there was a development of the Bengali movie industry, and some kind of scornful movies were being made of the military dictatorship, etc., through the idiom, through the metaphor of family. So there is a kind of, and in the sphere of paintings, as I mentioned, Zainal Abidin's painting on the global 60s, particularly on the Palestinian refugee camps, but also her paintings called Nobanno, the New Harvest, and imagines the rise of the new Bengali society through struggle and through a kind of agrarian social harmonious society based on some kind of socialistic celebration of real life, etc., inspired quite a lot the new generations in Bangladesh. And the other important thing which we should mention is the 1952 Bengali language movement. Pakistani military junta believed that Bengali, Pakistani ruling class, actually, in 1952, there was no military junta, believed that the Bengali was insufficiently Muslim language, and notwithstanding the fact that it was true Bengali language, Islam was spread in Bangladesh and Eastern Bengal. And so they said that it was insufficiently Muslim language, and so Urdu should be the national language of Pakistan. So Bengali Muslim poets, writers, students asserted and rallied around the Bengali, particularly the dialect of the Bengalis that is spoken in East Bengal, and distinguished themselves as a literature, poem, literature, and also film and playwrights and songs, etc., distinguished themselves from the West Bengali writings and asserted a kind of folk elements within the Bengali language, drawing from the bucolic roots of Islam in East Pakistan. So, in other words, they were contesting the fact that the language has very little to do with religious national identity, and that actually transformed the Bengali nationalist movement in East Pakistan.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much. There's a question from the audience. First and foremost, thank you so much for such a great presentation. Tariq Ali, who has written extensively on the 68 movement in West Pakistan, always compares it to the East Pakistan movement and states that the student movement in East Pakistan was a great deal more organized and educated. By contrast, then, would you say that the student movement in East Pakistan was more affluent and middle-class students as compared to the students in student movement in Karachi, for instance, which was more working class? Do you think the difference between East and West Pakistan's movement, at least in the cities, was led by a different urban demographic?
Well, I do not think so. I think that many of the students who actually led the student movement were first generation learners from the middle peasant background in East Pakistan, and the industrialization of Karachi was also a product of Ayub Khan's regime. And so in East Pakistan, we find that these students came from similar kind of background. And in West Pakistan also, the students who started the movement, particularly the kind of the within quote smuggling of the goods from Landi Kotal, etc., were also, and in the Gordon College, etc., were also from upper class background. Tariq Ali himself comes from quite an upper class background. And so I think students acted more as a non-class collective. And this is the students in Bangladesh, and I believe also in Pakistan, in the entire South Asia, is the kind of translator of the cultural modernization into into a rural society. And they were also looked upon by the peasants and the other segments of the society as some kind of bridge between outside world and the rural world, and they were perceived to be the future of the society. And that's why the students had so much influence in changing the paradigm of the movement in East Pakistan. But I do not think that there is a very different social demographics between Pakistani student movements, West Pakistani student movement and East Pakistani student movement. In fact, East Pakistan was far poorer at that point of time than West Pakistan.
I want to quote something that I read in your book, which I thought was very, very interesting. You write about, the middle peasants, the concept of the middle peasants. And here's what you said. These middle peasants alone had the necessary, quote unquote, minimal tactical freedom to challenge the established order. It was their children who moved into schools, colleges, and universities and participated in the radical movements in East Pakistan. Thus, class remained critical to political rebellion in the 60s. I thought that was a very interesting, sort of very nuanced look at this. And what you just said obviously reconfirms that particular argument.
Yeah. Well, it is the middle peasants which were the backbone of the East Pakistani society in terms of these were the first generation learners who moved into the schools, colleges, and universities, and were experimenting with new literary forms, were experimenting with plays and songs, etc. And so there is a kind of middle peasant roots to the entire thing. But these middle peasants were not very rich and affluent. They had just access to some surplus, and that's all, by global and by local standard as well. It's quite an indigent student community. It's not,
Understood. A final question, since we're at time, from the audience. So the assassination of Patrice Lumumba from Congo played a profound role in activating students in the global South. Why was his death able to garner such a reaction? Were there bilateral relations between Congo and Pakistan student exchange networks? Any additional context on that would be interesting.
Well, the first important thing is this, that I think in Bangladesh, people were aware, first of all, Pakistan was very deeply aligned with the United States at that point of time. They were members of the Baghdad Pact. They were members of the SEATO, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. And SEATO provided scholarships to students in East Pakistan. And but at the same time, these students, particularly those who were studying humanities, were very much aware that in Africa, there is a decolonization process taking place. And in 1960, particularly, so many African countries became independent. And so they were attracted to Africa. And at that point of time, two major events in Africa attracted their attention. Obviously, one is the Algerian liberation struggle, and the other is Congo, which was obviously at the headline of the newspapers worldwide. And so that attracted them to Congo. And Patrice Lumumba, since he was martyred, became a kind of symbol. As we know that martyrs are always a symbol. Obviously, the other symbol that we know of the youth movement in 1960s was Che Guevara. I mean, he had enormous presence in the student imagination, etc.
Great. Well, I cannot thank you enough, for, the time spent with us today, this morning for you, and the evening for some of us, and, somewhere in between for the rest of us, or even later. Thank you so much for such a rich and captivating talk. I think we learned a great deal. And, as I said to you earlier before we started, I'm a great fan of your work. So I'm very happy that we had the chance to connect in person. For the audience, thanks so much for being with us today. I'll defer to our next meeting on April 9th, when we are hearing from Natalia Ayo-Schmiedeke from the University of Hamburg on concretizing the revolutionary utopia through art in Latin America, Chile, and New Song and Ospel. But for the time being, thanks again, Professor Basu, for such a wonderful talk. And thanks again for being with us today.
Thank you. And I am also an avid reader of your work, and I learned quite a lot from your work. So the appreciation is mutual. I think I really loved your work. Thank you. And
thanks so much
for having me. Bye.
Appreciate it. You have a good day. Okay. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.